guys, so I'm about to make the 13th Doctor's socks, and I'd actually already started on a version a few weeks back, but I started using a sock loom, and I was using some yarn that I already had, which I had these colors, which I decided are not close enough to the socks in the picture, so I'm going to make them using different colors. Picked up these two blues. This is the Stylecraft double knit in Lapis, and this one is the Stylecraft double knit in Duck Egg. I will be writing a pattern for these socks. I'll make sure that I put it on my blog. It will be available for free, and I'll also make sure to list my yarns and then needle size, just in case you prefer a written format to a video format. In the promotional images for the 13th Doctor, you can only really see the sock from about here up, so that's really the part that's important to get right. The way that I made her sock is that I made it from the top down, which means that I started at the top and worked my way through to the bottom. And I did the heel as I went, so it went top, heel, and then bottom and toe. The toe is worked the exact same way as a heel. In order to make these socks, you're going to need 1 ball of dark blue yarn, 1 ball of light blue yarn, and 3.25mm knitting needles, which is a US size 3 or a UK 11. I'm using double pointed knitting needles for mine, which means that they have a point on both ends of the needle. So the first thing you're going to want to do is cast on 60 stitches onto your knitting needles. I'm not actually sure what the casting on method that I'm using is called, but I will show you how I do it. So the first thing I'm going to do is do a slip knot, and the way you do that is you take it in your hands like this. You take this top yarn, put it over the bottom one, so you have an X, and then reach through this loop, grab the yarn that's on the bottom, and pull it through to create a loop. I'm going to then put this loop onto a knitting needle and tighten it. So you should have this with 2 long pieces of yarn. Next, you're going to take your yarn in your hand like this. So the way I do that is I grab the yarn in my hand like this, and I flip my hand over, put my pointer and my thumb through, separate it out, and then bring my hand around. This is the first step to creating your stitches. Next up, you're going to take your needle, put the point under the first piece of yarn, then take it over here, loop it underneath the yarn that's on your thumb, pull it through the loop that's over your pointer finger, and let go of the loop over your pointer finger, and tighten it by picking up that yarn again. Let me show you this again. So you go under, grab your thumb loop, pull it through the pointer finger loop, let go. You're going to do this 60 times, distributing them evenly on your double pointed knitting needles. Here you can see that I've opted to cast on all of my stitches before distributing them. I just find this easier. You're welcome to distribute the stitches as you cast them on. So I'm just going to go ahead and redistribute these stitches now. I've just finished casting on my 60 stitches, and you may have noticed that I'm actually using 5 needles instead of 4 to cast on. And the reason I do this is so that I don't end up with a gap in between my starting and ending stitches. It's just sort of a personal preference and completely optional. We're going to create this rib stitch along the top of the sock. This helps to hold the sock up and prevents it from gaping at the top. Make sure that you've got your needles on the correct side. So you're going to want the side with the tail to be in your right hand and the side with no yarn to be in your left. We're going to start our rib stitch with just a simple knit 1, purl 1 all the way around. Once you finish that first part on that needle, you're going to have a free needle, and that's what you're going to use to continue that pattern. So as you work around, you're going to always be using all 5 of your needles with 2 of them in your hands, moving the stitches from your left hand to your right hand. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. You're going to go ahead and continue this knit, purl, rib for 8 rows. After you've finished your 8 rows of rib stitch, you're going to knit 8 rows of just straight knit stitch in the same dark blue color. This will create your first stripe, which should be wider than the rest of the stripes. Remember to keep track of your starting position. You can choose to use a stitch marker for this, but I don't feel the need to, as my starting yarn will always be in between my first and last stitch. Once you've completed your 8 rows of knit stitch in dark blue, you're going to want to start your first light blue stripe. You can do this pretty easily. Put your dark blue yarn to the back of your work, it's behind here, and take the end of your light blue, leaving a longer tail. Put your needle through and just simply loop the new light blue yarn as you would on a normal knit stitch. Make sure that you're not using the short tail as you knit and you're using the long tail. Do not cut the dark blue yarn. It makes it a lot easier to weave in ends if you only have 2 ends at the beginnings of the stripes. So make sure you don't cut your yarn in between stripes. Now do 4 rows of the light blue yarn in straight knit stitch. Once you've finished up your 4th row of the light blue yarn, you're going to switch back to the dark blue. The way I like to do this is by intertwining the 2 colors of yarn, and this helps prevent sort of holes or gaps like this one. What this sort of twist will do is just give you a line of yarn on the inside of the stripes that looks like this. The way to do this when you switch yarn is you just take new yarn over the old one, wrap it around, and knit it. And that will give you this sort of little loop. And then make sure that your old yarn is in the back of your work. You're going to continue your stripes in dark blue and light blue until you have a total of 11 stripes and only the first line of a light blue stripe. After you've completed 5 light blue and 5 dark blue stripes, you're ready to start on the heel. You're going to knit 20 stitches from this seam. This will become our center back. Next, we're going to set up to start our heel with the dark blue yarn. You can see here that I've transferred the stitches from that needle that bridged the gap onto 2 separate needles so that the seam is in between the 2. Next, I'm going to make sure I have 15 stitches from either side transferred onto these 2 needles, which is what I will be working on. For the heel, you will only be using these 2 needles. Starting at the middle, pick up the dark blue yarn and work 15 stitches. You will now have 15 dark blue and 15 light blue stitches on your needle. Next, turn your work, slip your first stitch from your left needle to your right, and then do 29 purl stitches. Turn your work, slip your first stitch from your left needle to your right needle, and work 28 knit stitches. You're going to continue on in this fashion for 15 more rows. That is, you're going to continue turning your work, slipping your first stitch, and knitting or purling 1 less stitch than the row before. The last row you complete should be a slip stitch followed by 14 purl stitches. Next up, you're going to turn your work, slip your first stitch, knit 13 stitches. You'll notice a gap in between your 2 stitches. The way you're going to close this gap is by putting your left needle into a stitch in between your previously worked stitch and the next stitch you'll work. So now you have an extra stitch on your needle, and then you will knit through both of those stitches. Turn your work, you're going to purl 14 stitches. Once again, you're going to notice a gap in between your last worked stitch and your next one, and you'll fix it by picking up a stitch and purling through both of those stitches. Then you're going to turn, and you'll continue on in this fashion, that is, knitting or purling 1 more stitch than in your last row, picking up a stitch and knitting 2 together, for a total of 15 of those rows. Once you've reached the end of your last row, which should be a knit row, go ahead and turn your work and work 15 purl stitches. Once you've finished those purl stitches, you are done with your heel. Go ahead and readjust the stitches on your needles to the positions that they were at before you started your heel. Find where you left off with your light blue yarn and finish the row that you started. When you get to the edge of the heel, you may find it necessary to close the gap between your stitches much the same way that you did in the heel by picking up a stitch with your left needle and knitting through both that loop and the next stitch at the same time. Once you've finished that row, you can go ahead and complete the other 2 rows needed to finish your 4-row stripe. From there on, continue striping in the same way that you did for the body of the sock until you have it the length that you require to fit your foot. I ended up doing 5 stripes of each color for the foot of my sock, but you might have to do a different amount depending on your foot size. Be sure to try on the sock as you go to ensure that your fit is correct. Once you've completed your final light blue stripe, you can go ahead and cut your yarn, as you won't be using this light blue anymore. Now you can begin the toe of your sock. This is worked in the dark blue yarn and is made exactly the same way as your heel was, so you can go ahead and refer back to those instructions to make your toe. The last row on your toe should be purl 29 and then add a stitch and purl those 2 together. Next we're going to finish this seam here with a kitchenette stitch. This is easiest if you put your work onto 2 needles, all of your dark blue stitches onto one, and all of your light blue stitches from this stripe onto the other needle. Now that you've got your stitches onto 2 needles, you can go ahead and cut your dark blue yarn, leave a long tail for actually completing your kitchenette stitch. Now all that's left is to weave in the ends. All I've done here is turn my sock inside out. I didn't knot either of the threads that I had at the top of my sock, and I'm not going to, but I will show you how I like to weave in my ends. What I like to do is I'll take this light blue yarn and take it behind the very first row that I made with the blue yarn in the sock. I find this creates a very secure woven edge. This very top blue thread, so as not to lose any of the stretchiness, I'm going to go ahead and weave it around this vertical row of stitches on the inside of the sock. I weave the yarn ends at the toe of the sock in the same way as I do that one at the top, which is along these rows here. The 13th Doctor's shoes are laced up a little bit differently than the average shoe. They're laced up in a spiral lace, which you do by leaving one of the tails of your lace longer than the other. You take your lace that comes from the eyelet on the right at the bottom. You're going to go up through the second one on the left, down through the second one on the right, back up through the one on the left, down on the right again, and then up on your right on the 4th eyelet, and you're going to take your other lace from the bottom, go up on the left, and tie a double knot there.